Hey, welcome back. Today we're going to really dive into biology and look at the characteristics of living things, really is what we're doing today. Now, it's never been stated so far, but biology is the study of life. I mean, there you go. Now, biology, if you ask me, is the most important science that exists for people because it's where we've developed medicine from. It's where we've understood how our body works, and it's what's allowed us to live better, longer, healthier lives. So I think it just has to be the most important science that we have. That actually says that right there. So anyways, what makes something alive? Despite the great diversity that exists with life, it's totally easy to tell a living thing from a non-living thing. Even if it's just a pile of goo, of slime, versus, I don't know, dirt or whatever. Does the slime really tell you all that much? Well, no, but you can tell that it's alive because of certain characteristics. And all living things, because we're all related, because of evolution, there are certain minimum characteristics that we all must share. Now, if you look at a person, we could classify ourselves as mammals. So there are mammal characteristics: body hair, live birth, except for the monotremes, lactate and feed milk to our young, warm-blooded, 7 neck vertebra. That's a mammal characteristic. There's one other that I can't remember, but we don't have any of those things in common with reptiles, for example. But there are other characteristics that we share with reptiles. Sure, there are characteristics that we share with plants and fungi and even single-celled organisms. But you can boil it down to just these particular 7. So, the first is that living things are made of one or more cells. The cell is the individual unit of life. Anything that we consider alive is whatever it is that makes it alive is encased within a cell. Now, earlier I said that life is nothing but a series of chemical reactions. And, well, that's basically true. Even one single cell has trillions of chemical reactions going on in it all the time. But that is sort of, at its most basic, that's what it is. Living things reproduce. So we don't have just some organisms and they live forever and that's it. No, there's different ways of reproduction, but there you go. All living things contain DNA or are based on a universal genetic code. Now, viruses, which are not alive, do have DNA in them. And that's where we bridge the gap. That's where this is right on the threshold of something that's not quite considered alive, but has many of the characteristics of something that is alive. We will probably talk about that together as a group. Living things grow and develop. So you can think of a baby growing up into an adult, or a maggot turns into a fly. They look very different. Living things obtain and use materials and energy. The only way you can grow and develop is if you consume nutrients and use them to build tissues and things like that. The chemical reactions, that's all it is. It's you break down, so like you eat a meal, the cells in your body chemically break it down and then reconvert it into muscle protein or hair protein or skin cells or whatever it is. Living things respond to their environment. That can be addressed in a series of different ways. Living things maintain a stable internal environment. We call that homeostasis. And the final one, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Sorry, there's actually 8, not 7. The final one is that living things change over time. That means evolve. So life evolves over time. Now, we're going to expand on every one of these, and that'll be our discussion for today. So, made of cells. A cell is a collection of living matter encased in a phospholipid membrane that separates itself from the surroundings. So, like in science fiction or goofy TV shows, maybe you see like there's some sort of living force and it can talk and communicate, but it's just like a cloud of vapor or something that floats through the air. That's not what living things are. Are there things that we would consider alive that can communicate on other planets that are like that? Who knows? But there aren't any on this planet. So the cell is the smallest unit of an organism, considered to be alive. Every cell in your body is its own living thing. We could remove any type of cell from your body we want to, keep it in a petri dish, incubate it. As long as we kept it at the right temperature, it had enough moisture, and it had nutrients and all those things, it would continue living without you. Your body is just a series of networks and mechanisms that deliver all of the necessary things to your cells. It's like a brain cell. How does it get oxygen and nutrients? Well, all of that through the bloodstream, right? And that's what, if you take like a anatomy and physiology class, that's what we learn about. I actually teach anatomy and physiology here. So there you go. And actually, we grow skin cultures that way. People that have been burn victims, we actually implant on their skin living human tissue, but that tissue starts off as a tiny little sample, and then we just control it and give it all it needs, and it keeps dividing so we can use them as skin grafts. Everything that you do, your cells also do. What happens with the oxygen you breathe? Well, it goes into your lungs and then into your bloodstream, and it's used inside of your cells for a specific process. The food you eat, it goes into your cells, and it's broken down and reassembled into new compounds. Your sweat, that's excreted by your cells. When you defecate, that's the leftovers from your cells. Same with when you urinate, that's leftover material from your cells. I guess your cells don't talk like we talk, but they do communicate through chemicals. Things like positive chemotaxis. You can look that up if you want to. It's part of how your immune system works. Your cells do talk to each other through hormones and things like that. Unicellular organisms dominate the planet. Every surface on our planet has unicellular organisms in it. In fact, unicellular organisms dominate multicellular organisms. Your gut biome, you have as many bacteria. We used to think you had 10 times the number of bacteria in your digestive tract as you do in the rest of your body. We've since revised that. We think it's around a 1-to-1 ratio, or there's about twice as many. Now, you might be thinking, how could they have thought it was 10 times? Well, if this is how big one of your cells is in your body, a bacteria is only maybe about that big, or perhaps that big. They're incredibly, incredibly tiny. Now, you might be thinking, I don't want bacteria in my gut. Well, what would happen is if you took all the bacteria out of your gut, you would actually die. You need them to live. They do things for you. Now, they benefit from us too. They get food and nutrients and whatever. But we've evolved to need them, actually. All right. So a multicellular unicellular organisms, everything they need to do is encased within them. Multicellular organisms, we have organs. We have specialized parts that perform specific functions. But really, we're just keeping all the other cells alive. I have muscles, so I can move around and gather food, and I have a digestive system to process that food so that my brain activity can keep going. My brain's made of cells, so there you go. Here are some multicellular organisms. This is a paramecium. I think I said multicell. These are single-celled organisms. Sorry. Now, a paramecium, it's going to be difficult for you to tell, but around its entire external surface of its body, it's got little tiny hairs. We call them cilia, and those hairs just wiggle, and that's how they swim. And they can actually swim pretty fast. This is what's called a stentor. It looks like a trumpet. It has those cilia around the mouth of the trumpet, and this is the organism's mouth. It doesn't It can't chew. It doesn't have body parts. It's one cell. But it engulfs material and just simply dissolves it. This is an amoeba. Amoebas move around by just the blob. Really old, terrible horror movie was inspired by amoebas. They just stretch out their body and crawl around. And this is what's called a volvox. I don't really know anything about volvoxes, volvoxi. I don't know. But those are its babies on its inside. There you go. So this is human tissue. I don't remember particularly what kind of tissue this is, but each of these purple things is the nucleus of a cell, and then just kind of the pink area immediately around it is the rest of the cell. So whatever we're looking at here, when you say tissue, you mean all the cells around it are the same. So in my brain, all the nerve tissues are pretty close to the same. You wouldn't find a muscle cell inside there, for example. So, that's what we're seeing. But the human body is made up of many, many, many different types of tissue. We have bone tissue, which you can see clearly here in the bones. Here are the vertebra. You can see part of the skull, the knees here, the foot bones, the thigh bone. Muscle tissue, you can see that absolutely everywhere. We can see all kinds of organs. There's the brain, here's the spinal cord, the two lungs, the heart, this would be the stomach, here's the liver. Parts of the intestine are exposed. This thing right there is a kidney, that's the bladder. I don't know if this is a man or a woman. I can't tell. It's a woman, so, here's the reproductive organs right here, that'd be the vagina. So this is probably the uterus right through here as well. And then the light-colored white area, that would be like fat deposits underneath the skin. All of these things serve to keep the entire organism alive. Okay, reproduction. There are two different types. Sexual reproduction means you combine cells from two separate organisms and they fuse into one cell, and so that one cell will then divide into many. There are different kinds of sexual reproduction. Fish, they lay their eggs, and then the male comes over and just dispenses his sperm, and the sperm swim through the water and fertilize those eggs. We call that external, what do you call that? External fertilization. But other animals that lay eggs, like reptiles, birds, they have internal fertilization. The two animals have sex, and for mammals, they give birth to live young. So the two individuals have sex, and then they lay the egg or give live birth. There are very, very strange exceptions to this. There are certain types of animals. It's most common in fish. Fish have, in terms of the animal kingdom, fish are some of the very oldest animals. They can give birth to young without ever having had sex. And we might expand on that in this lecture if you want to, when we get back into class, or for sure in a later chapter. That's something I wanted to investigate, because it's really fascinating. But anyways, that's sexual reproduction. Asexual, if you put a in front of a word, it means without. So this is without sex. This is where a single parent produces an offspring that is genetically identical to it. All bacteria, all single-celled organisms, all single-celled organisms do asexual reproduction. Some multicellular organisms do too. Now, I'm not talking about the fish from this example. I'm talking about other examples. The two kinds of asexual reproduction are binary fission and budding. So this is what bacteria do, is binary fission. The cell just simply grows bigger, copies all of its DNA, and then splits its DNA between the two halves and pinches itself apart. Actually, your body does this. So at only one time and that's true for all animals, there was only ever one time when two cells came into one, and that was at conception, fertilization. After that, every single cell in your body got there from this binary fission process, which is pretty amazing. This is a multicellular animal. It's called a hydra, and they do what's called the budding. So here's a baby hydra growing just from its surface. The cells within a hydra are all extremely similar. So eventually this little guy here will pinch off and float around and latch onto a rock in the sea and be his own thing. I'm not sure what this video is or if it will work. Nope, it won't work. I bet it was just a video of binary fission. What's really incredible is bacteria. So this process of splitting through binary fission, so you get 1, and that turns into 2, and then the 2 turn into, oh geez, I wrote 3. 4, and then 4 become 8, 8 becomes 16, 16 become 32, so on and so on. Bacteria can do that once every half hour. So that means that they can divide and double their number 48 times in one day in 24 hours. Now, this looks like it's not adding up to very much, but very, very quickly, these numbers become gigantic. I'm actually going to do it on my phone because I don't remember what it is off the top of my head. But, so it'd be the... So, one bacteria in a 24-hour period can turn into 140 trillion. That's how many sort of offspring it can have in one day. In one day. Amazing. Okay. All living things based on a universal genetic code. In other words, they have DNA inside of them. Now, DNA contains the instructions, the information that allows cells to function. What's amazing is a multicellular organism, all of the DNA in all of the cells is the same. So my brain cells only need to use the parts of the DNA that tell brain cells how to work. My muscle cells use a completely different set of the DNA code that I have, but both of them have all of the DNA. So a stomach cell has the genes that the brain cells are using, the other muscle cells are using, the liver cells are using, all of them. It's all there. And that's because we start off as that one cell with a copy of DNA. That DNA is duplicated and then split between the two cells. And then each of those two cells does that exact same thing over and over and over again. Because of sexual reproduction involves the unification of two different cells, that means you get a mixture of DNA. So that's why sexual reproduction has been crucial in the lineages of animals and plants and things that go on, because excuse me, because the mixing of DNA produces variation in the offspring, and some of the variation is good, some of it's not so good, and that's what leads to evolution. On the other hand, asexual reproducing offspring, their offspring are totally identical. They're clones of their parents, because the parent's just giving its own DNA, and that doesn't change. So there we go. This is just kind of a picture of DNA inside of a cell. We're going to do an entire chapter over DNA, so skip that. Now, with growth and development, some organisms, like the single-celled organisms, this guy will just simply get bigger. It doesn't really go through any major life cycle changes at all beyond growth. But other organisms go through differentiation. You start off as one cell that divides into 2 and then 4, blah, blah, blah. When you're only 100 cells big, you don't yet have any muscle cells or bone cells or brain cells. They're all stem cells. They're blank. They could become anything at all. So you have to wait till the organism is many thousands of cells, and then they start to turn into certain kinds of tissue. And that's what that says. Okay, moving on. So here's an example of that. So these are stem cells. When you early on in development, when you're growing, you actually turn into this hollow ball, and then the ball sort of indents on itself. It's a really cool process that we will investigate later this year. But at this point, that cell right there is not a muscle cell or a brain cell. It's nothing. It's just a human cell, and same with that one and that one. And then, as you go through development, you can see there's all kinds of changes. This doesn't even look like a person. It looks more like a baby pig, if you ask me, with the face and everything. And then way back here, if we look, I don't know what that looks like, but you can see the hands and the feet have webbing in them. That tissue needs to degrade so that we're not born with webbed hands or feet. The eye, the face, they're really not recognizable. Those structures haven't been developed yet. You have a tail for a while you're developing. That's absorbed. Those cells are gotten rid of. But after a human is born, or think of any animal that's familiar, like a reptile or a bird or any kind of mammal. Their babies pretty much just look like small versions of the adult. They don't really change very much except in proportion. However, other animals, particularly we see this with insects, they metamorphosize. They turn into something completely different. Now, a tadpole does this too, so there's an amphibian doing it, but there we go. So without a constant supply of oxygen, water, and nutrients, your cells would fail, begin to die, and then you would die. So it would shut down the chemistry of what's going on in your cells, because life is just chemistry. It's just a series of chemical reactions. And we call that metabolism, the collection of chemical reactions which an organism builds up or breaks down materials for life processes. That's why you need to eat. That's why you need to breathe. That's why you need to drink water. Your body uses every one of those things to assemble or disassemble something, to build, and then make your body grow and develop, or whatever. Now, although all organisms use energy, the source they get that energy from has some variation to it. So plants, I need to drink water real quick. Plants don't really eat. Plants make their own food. That's what photosynthesis is. They absorb carbon dioxide gas, and they absorb water, and you can think of it like Legos. So think of carbon dioxide as one type of Lego brick and oxygen as a different type of Lego brick. Well, even with only 2 Legos, you could build a house, or you could build a car, or you could build a bridge, or you could build anything with that. And that's what the plant does. It breaks apart and recombines the atoms in those molecules to build itself. And it borrows energy from the sun to do that. That's what charges it, basically. So we have like a meat platter. There's some veggies here, but lots of meat here. Maybe you don't eat plants, you eat animals, like you're a carnivore or whatever. Well, you still rely on the plant for your energy. But anyways, so we eat these things, and I eat pasta or meat or veggies, and my digestive system breaks those things down into individual little Lego brick molecules and grow new hair, grow new fingernails, replace my skin cells, build muscle tissue if I've been working out. If I get a cut, my body will replace the tissue that was cut away there or whatever with these building blocks right here. And then there are some stranger ones. So we didn't know that these existed until the 1980s, very recently. But at the bottom of the ocean in places, there are what are called hydrothermal vents. They're cracks in Earth's crust where incredibly hot water and chemicals boil up through the surface, and that's what this cloud is. So the things that live here don't need any sunlight. So if the sun just vanished, life on the bottom of the oceans could continue for a very, very incredibly long time. What happens is this whole ecosystem is based on bacteria. Now the bacteria do this thing called chemosynthesis. They absorb compounds that have sulfur in them, and then they take water and carbon dioxide from around, and they break it down and build it into building blocks. Now, these big things you see all around are called tube worms. They have this tube isn't exactly part of their body. It's kind of like an exo shield that they make. But if you look on the tips of them, they have a feathered appearance. It's red and feathery, and they're sort of like gills. They capture and filter feed that bacteria, and that's their food. That's where they get all of their nutrients from. So it's a whole ecosystem based on that. All right, so responding to the environment can mean anything. It can be searching for food because you're hungry, the way you interact with other organisms, migrating in response to weather, or maybe migrating to find food as well. But in any case, we call those stimuli, which is the plural of stimulus, a signal in the environment that triggers a reaction. So it can be any type of thing, really, at all. I don't want to say anything else. Why do I have that? So anyways, this is what's called the resurrection flower. What it is it's a really cool plant. It will, when water runs out for pretty much every other plant on the planet, if they don't get any water for a few days or a few weeks or a few months, or definitely a year, they die. And there's no coming back from that. But this plant has somehow found out a way it can have virtually all of the water in its cells disappear, but it goes into hibernation. You could pretty much say it's dead, because the difference between what it is in this state right now versus if we took it and chopped it up into dust and powder, there'd be no difference. So it's kind of weird. Is this thing alive right now? It's not responding to the environment or growing or reproducing or anything, but we can bring it back. This plant, I had a professor in college that had these. She could leave it in a drawer for more than a year and then just simply place it into a dish with water, and over a few minutes or hours, it will reabsorb the water, turn green again, and it will open up and it'll start photosynthesizing, and it's alive. Now, if we ripped it up into pieces and tried doing that, well, it wouldn't work because you've broken its body apart. But it's really weird. It's like it's dead in both cases, but it could still be alive as long as you don't break it into pieces. So this is another example of like, is it alive or not? Or it's weird. Okay. So you have to keep your internal environment intact, and we call that homeostasis, the maintenance of a stable internal environment. An easy way to kill a living thing is stab it with something and watch its innards pour out. Well, you're not maintaining a stable internal environment, so there you go. But other factors can influence that too. The temperature. If I get too cold, I will become hypothermic, and your body chemistry is pretty finicky and picky. You need the right temperatures in order to function right. So if I cool down my internal body temperature too much, I've destroyed the homeostasis, and people die from that. But there are, so that's a response from an external stimuli, but there are internal stimuli too. The feeling you get when you're hungry or when you're thirsty, that's really hard to explain exactly what that is or what exactly it feels like. But it's your body telling your brain to tell your muscles to go eat food or something like that. It's kind of funny, but that's what it is. All right. Evolution. Maybe one of the things that's hard for people to explain. And I have heard people argue against evolution. I go out and find people who will argue against it just so I can educate myself on what the skeptics are saying. So one of the things that people just can't imagine is, you're telling me that we went from single-celled organisms to multi-celled organisms. Well, yes, that's the case. Now, this is very hard to believe, but first of all, it's taken billions of years for that to happen. And a billion years is such a long time scale that us humans, we can't really interpret what that's like, billions of years. It's an incredibly, incredibly long period of time. Now, the changes are incredibly gradual. Even though you take an organism, its offspring will look so close to its parents that you'll say, there's really no difference. But over 10 million years, maybe now all of a sudden there is a very big difference from one to the other. Now, what I do to help students understand this is, just imagine this. Imagine if you took a picture just of your face every single day of your life. So, we'll just pick me. I'm 27 years old. Would there be I could go to any point in this timeline of 27 years, pick any picture. Would there be a single picture the day before or the day after where I look totally different, barring like a haircut or something like that? Well, no. Would there be any single point where I look different 10 pictures before or after? Or even 100 pictures before or after? Probably no, not really, not at all. So you don't see the change happening. But now what if I looked at a picture of myself 5 years ago versus today? Yeah, all of a sudden the differences are, for an older person, the differences might be kind of not so noticeable. Now obviously the difference between a newborn and a 5-year-old is huge. But those differences are there. They just come up very, very slowly over time. So evolution is the mechanism that has allowed plants, animals, fungi, bacteria, whatever, to colonize the entire planet. Because I'm not adapted to living in the oceans, but a whale is. A whale is a mammal just like I am. We share a huge number of characteristics. It's just taken millions of years of slow, gradual change for the whale to be able to live in the water and thrive there. They can't live outside of the water. So as an example of like an adaptation, this is Death Valley. Its name alone implies that it's not very particular to life. It's the hottest place on Earth. The hottest temperature that's ever been recorded on Earth has been recorded more than once here. It's like 136 degrees Fahrenheit, I think. And it can go decades with no rain in some places. But despite that, several years ago, it rained in Death Valley for the first time in a really long time. And all these seeds and flowers that had been laying dormant bloomed. So it's something you only see a couple times every 100 years. But life can find a way to adapt and thrive, even in a terrible environment like that. So a biologist can work in multiple different environments. Some biologists do all their work inside of a lab because they study medicine or microbes or disease, and you wouldn't want to go outside and look for diseases. That would be terrible. We want to control them in the laboratory. Others work in zoos, or they do work outside, or they work wherever. Biology can take you anywhere. Some biologists are studying single-celled organisms. Some are studying large organisms. Some biologists aren't even studying living organisms. They're studying the chemistry or maybe the variables that influence living things. That can still be considered biology. So we break down our levels of organization. So the smallest units are atoms and molecules. So like the oxygen in the air or the carbon dioxide and water that plants absorb. They take those and they break them apart and reassemble them, and they build them into molecules. And those molecules build up into cells. And cells, when you have a group of cells, it's called a tissue. A large tissue or a large collection of tissue can form an organ, like a stomach. But the stomach works in tandem with your esophagus and your large and small intestine to make an organ system. But that organ system is only one of many organ systems that makes up an organism. So an entire single living unit. Now for single-celled organisms, we would get rid of this one, that one, and that one. But whatever. And then we can expand a little further A population is a group of the same organism. So the scientist that works only in the lab is only studying maybe the scientist that or biologist that works in the lab maybe is only studying molecules, or maybe they only study tissues, or maybe they only study individual cells. It could, well, in fact, there are many doctors or scientists that do that, but others study entire populations of organisms. So it can only be one. So the population of deer in a field, maybe. Or maybe they look at the community. So, okay, well, the deer and the different plants that they eat, and the different predators that prey upon the deer. That's the community. The ecosystem ties in all of this stuff plus the non-living factors, like the weather, the amount of water, the quality of the soil, that kind of thing. And then lastly, the biosphere. That's just the entire planet. So that's all of the ecosystems. They do, on some level, kind of interact with each other. So, that takes us to the biosphere. And I believe that is the end of this discussion. Thanks.